My name is Adrian Odell, and this is the Norfolk Polish Heritage Group Archive Project. Today is the 11th of February 2019, and I'm here this afternoon to introduce and to speak to Stefan Young Pietrzak about his father. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you first tell me a little bit about your father, for instance, his name, when he was born and where he was born?
Yes, my father was Aleksander Pietrzak, and he was born in Warsaw in 22nd of January 1915.
And did he come from a big family? What was his family situation?
His father was a professor of mathematics, and he had a brother, Ryszak, and a sister, Małgosia.
And did you have any contact with them at any time?
Yes, towards the end of the communist regime, I went to Poland for the first time, and I met them there in Warsaw.
What do you know about your father's early life?
Not a lot. I wasn't ever able to speak to my uncle, Ryszak, in any detail. So I don't know too much. I know that he was in the Polish Air Force prior to the Second World War, and my assumption is he'd qualified as a pilot by 1939.
And do you know the story of what happened after the German invasion in 1939?
From little I know, he didn't actually fly in the battles against the German Air Force from Poland, but at the capitulation he then escaped to Romania, and from there, through various routes, managed to get to England.
Yes, I think there were many Poles, 200 or 300 Polish Air Force personnel who left Warsaw when the Germans invaded in September the 6th, 1939, and then were squeezed when the Russians came in from the east as well. So the only route for escape for them was south through Romania. And do you have any documentation at all of that period, or you said you don't know really the route that he took?
No, the first official documentation we have is after his induction into the Royal Air Force. The Polish Air Force is part of the Royal Air Force, and that would have been in 41. So we don't have any documentation from the Polish era. It was all destroyed.
But I understand he was in France for a period.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
We have a picture of him in his pilot's uniform with his arm around two girls, of course, in Lyon in 1940. We have that. But we don't know what he was doing there, and I don't believe he was flying with the French Air Force. I think he was trying to, but I don't think he had time to get into an aeroplane there.
Yes, I think France was one safe area where Poles could gather. They were welcomed by the French, but I'm not sure about whether there was any action from France. And what was his route after leaving France? Do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, I believe he came out of France in the south by Saint-Jean-de-Luz, but I don't know what the route after that. We know we believe he landed in Blackpool. That's the first record we have of him in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Blackpool was a distribution centre for incoming Polish Air Force personnel. And what about after Blackpool? Do you know where he...
Yeah, he went on a training course, a mandatory training course, various airfields around England, and he was up in Scotland. And he was at an operational training unit in Grangemouth in, I think, 1943, and then became operational.
And he was a pilot?
He was a pilot, yeah, a very good pilot.
Which planes did he fly?
He flew the Spitfire and later the Mustang. He was a fighter pilot, and the Mustang was used on long-range escort duties. and also ground attack role in 44 and 45. And he was then stationed, I think, around Northolt, in Northolt, on protecting London from the V1s, where he became an ace, shooting down several V1s, which was a very dangerous occupation indeed.
And do you have any details of his service?
Well, we have one, I suppose, amusing but rather harrowing story that in the very early days when they were attacking V1s, no one really had any information, and my dad had a predilection as a pilot of getting very close to the enemy before opening fire. So he opened fire from a very close range at this V1 that promptly blew up in front of him. And so big was the explosion that it blew his propellers off, damaged the wing, and he was very low because these things were flying very low. And one of his co-pilots, one of his pilot pals, later recorded that if he hadn't been such a strong man, he'd have never got out of the cockpit in time. But he managed to get out, open his parachute, and just landed without breaking his neck.
So this was over land rather than water?
Yeah, it was over land. And I think he got one of his awards for that. And also joined the Caterpillar Club, of course, of being in a parachute, although I was told it was only for a few seconds.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the Caterpillar Club.
That was for people who got out of an aircraft via parachute, and the Irving Parachute Company awarded anyone who successfully bailed out a little Caterpillar badge.
And he was stationed at Northolt.
Yes.
And I think that's where he met your mother, his wife-to-be.
Yes.
Tell me about that encounter.
Well, my grandmother had an open house for the Polish families, of course, who didn't have anywhere to go. And he was one of the Poles that turned up to her house for a cup of tea. And my mother, who was 15 at the time, was obviously rather smitten by him and began a secret liaison with him that my grandmother eventually found out. And she went to complain to the commanding officer at RAF Northolt that one of his pilots was seducing her daughter, who was only 15 at the time, and it had to stop. And the CO agreed with him that was just unacceptable. And the next thing my mother told me was she came home from school one day and opened the kitchen door to find my father sitting at the kitchen table with her mother, getting on like a house on fire. And he'd obviously won her over in the short period that he'd been there. And to my mother's great surprise, he'd convinced her that he should be allowed to marry her, because there was her engagement ring on the table. So she was engaged at 15, and she married at 16, was a mother at 17, and that's where I come from, and a widow at 17.
Good heavens. And how did he die?
In a flying accident, 3 months after the war. It seems so tragic, at least to me, that he should fly as a very brave and expert pilot, going through who knows what dangers, and then to die in a flying accident 3 months after the war. Doesn't seem fair to me.
Indeed. You talked about getting in contact with a German pilot that your father shot down. Would you tell us that story, please?
Yes, he was on a mission over Denmark, a long-range mission with 4 or 5 other Mustang pilots, and they encountered this gaggle of Messerschmitts, and he managed to shoot down a couple of them. And I remember looking at his logbook when I was about 7 or 8 and seeing this picture of Messerschmitt taken through the camera gun. They took pictures of the aircraft as they were shooting them down, and thinking to myself how glad I was that he'd popped another German. And years later, a researcher who works with our website, aircrewremembered.com, said, look, I've become in contact with this German fighter pilot, and I think it's the guy that your dad shot down. And so we put him in contact, and by comparing his logbook with my dad's logbook, we could see, yeah, it was the same guy. And so it was an extraordinary thing that the German pilot's name was Rose, Arno Rose, that the Rose family line And the Pietrzak family line should cross in 1944 over Denmark. And 30 years later, our family line should cross again on a phone call from Norwich to this guy's home in Germany. Extraordinary.
And what was his name? Rose?
Arno Rose.
Arno Rose. What was his reaction when he spoke to you?
He said that he'd always wanted to meet the man that shot him down. And he was sad to hear that my father was dead, but that he was proud to speak to his father, because he said that by being shot down, my father had saved his life, which seemed an extraordinary thing to say. But Arno told me that if he hadn't been shot down and badly injured, he would have flown against the American bombers in their ramming. The German Luftwaffe was ramming the American bombers at that stage, and he said he probably would have died. So if my father hadn't shot him down, he'd have died. So he was grateful. Extraordinary thing to say.
And after your father's death, what was her story after he died?
My mother could never really talk about that part of her life, and I just wasn't able to ask her. So it's only hearsay and little bits and pieces that I've gleaned. But she must have been, a widow at 17 when her prince had died, with a little boy. It must have been really, really difficult. But she was very lucky, because some years later she met a man who became my stepfather and the father of my 3 siblings, and had a wonderful life with him. So she managed to rescue something from what could have been a tragedy.
You didn't tell us about your father's Norfolk connections.
No, he was stationed up in Coltishall for a couple of months. And my mother told me that he really liked the countryside, the Norfolk countryside. It reminded him of the flat lands outside Warszawa. And he'd said to her at the time, after the war, this would be where he would like to live. So, strangely enough, in the 1950s, late 1950s, my mother and my stepfather found themselves in Norfolk. And so she fulfilled at least half of that promise.
And so she lived in Norfolk?
Yeah, lived in Norfolk from the late 50s onwards.
And today we've also got Kelvin, who is your stepbrother, here with us. I understand that the two of you were clearly interested in your heritage, and that you founded a website called Aircrews Remembered. Is that just about the Polish Air Force?
No, aircrewremembered.com is now one of the largest historical sites in the world. And it we have the largest database of Luftwaffe pilots, the Krakow Luftwaffe archive. We have a huge collection of New Zealand, Australian, Canadian, and of course Polish details, histories of pilots. It's very well known, and we work very closely with the Polish authorities. We're consulted by them, and we consult them on historical research. And it was really down to my brother, who runs the whole editorial side of that. I just provide the technical details and the design of the site. He does all the work. Well, he and his team have about 15 people worldwide contributing to the site now.
Yes, I've seen the site. It's a remarkable piece of work.
Thank you.
And what do you plan for the future regarding this?
We're just going to try to expand. For every person we have on the site, there's 100 whose stories haven't been told. And we don't want them to just disappear into the, into history without being recorded anywhere. In the past, nobody knew the stories of the foot soldiers. We know which general won the Battle of Waterloo, but we don't know anything about the warrant officers, the sergeants and the pikemen. We don't know their names. Thanks to the internet, we at least now, in this day and age, have the opportunity to have everyone's story told, and that's our mission. We have 5 million data items on the site now, and there's probably 500 million still to be gathered.
And do you still go back to Poland?
Yes, we're well connected with the Krakow Museum, the Air Museum at Krakow. They have a They have my father's medals and the logbooks and his uniform on display there. And we work with them on research projects. In fact, we have we're going to go in this year. We're going back to Krakow with a group of caricatures done by a Polish airman, a prisoner of war. Very moving pictures that he's done. And my brothers collated them, and we're going to present them to the museum.
So, how long have you yourself lived? Have you lived in Norfolk since when your mother moved here? Then
yes, I was at school here for a couple of years, and then I went off to university, and then I became an executive with IBM and travelled all over the world. And I moved back from America. I was living in California for 15 years, and I moved back in about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And you clearly still feel very strongly about your Polish roots.
I do, yes. Once a Pole, always a Pole, I think. And even though I never grew up in a Polish society because my dad was dead, I feel a very strong affiliation. And when I went to Poland for the first time, it was a very moving and emotional experience for me. Felt like coming home.
Hmm. And what are your views now about the latest influx of Poles? We had the Poles during the war coming to Norfolk. We had the ones during the communist period of Gomulka. And then in 2004 with the European Union connection. What do you feel about the Polish community in Norfolk and Britain today?
I can only think that it's mutually beneficial. The Poles that I've met over here are hard-working, law-abiding, want to do well for themselves. And in my experience, they came here in order to get some economic benefits, because Poland, even post the communist regime, still wasn't doing that well. But now Poland is quite a wealthy nation in its own right, and there's no need for the Poles to come here if they don't want to. But if they do come here, then I feel they should be very welcomed. We have a proud heritage of Polish contributions to the freedom of this country, and I think that the average British person respects Polish people for their willingness to work hard.
I agree, and Norfolk in particular has had migrations here since the Vikings, basically, and before that the Anglo-Saxons. So we are used to immigration here. We have about 6,000 Poles in Norfolk now. How's your Polish, by the way?
Not too good, a bit shabby really. I spoke conversational Polish, I taught myself conversational Polish in order to speak with my grandmother. Because, and that was a very emotional thing when I first went back to Poland. It was in the communist era. My mother was frightened that I'd be in trouble with the police because the attitude the communists were towards Poles who'd been in the West. So I was nervous, but I decided I had to go before she died. And she was crippled and had to walk with like a Zimmer frame. And when I went to my uncle's house, where I thought she was maybe staying there, and I knocked on the door, and my uncle opened the door, and he didn't know I was going to arrive. I didn't want to tell anyone I was going to come in case I got stopped at the border. So he opened the front door, and he looked at me, and he suddenly realised who I was. He said, "Stefan." And the next thing, he was thrown out of the way by my grandmother, who'd walked unaided across the room, thrown him out of the way, and grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let me go.
Well, you've told us some remarkable stories this afternoon, so I'd like to thank you very much indeed for cooperating and collaborating with the Norfolk Polish Heritage Group on this archive project. Thank you very much indeed, Stefan.
Thank you for asking me.